Right. So this week, the subject is the cost of doing nothing. And before we go into what the cost is, let's understand what the nothing is first. I think from me, from my perspective, it's even though I'll be coming from a business perspective, I guess some of these things will relate to individuals and their careers. But for me, it's, I guess there's sort of two sides to it. There's the knowing that you're doing nothing and you're just leaving it and not acting upon it. So you're leaving it too long. Procrastination, essentially. And then there's the not knowing. So you're just carrying on, you're being content, and you're just carrying on regardless. And the world is sort of moving around you, and you're just not aware of it. So I think there's, I guess, the two sides of that. You could probably see it from a sort of a reactive and a proactive sort of standpoint as well. So for me, I guess it's just discussing that a little bit, understanding what that is. For me, again, coming from a software development perspective, procrastination is something that tends to be seen as a negative thing in business. A lot of leaders will say, for example, making the wrong decision is sometimes better than no decision. I guess from a software development perspective, we try and leave decisions to the very last moment in time because we have more information to back those decisions up. So just look at it from that perspective. We often do wait, and that waiting can be a good thing, and not making decisions too early in the process, because some information could come to light that would change the direction or change the solution. So what are your thoughts on how do you see doing nothing and in your sort of realm?
Yeah, I think for me, there's two or three things that you've said, along with the general principle. One, I genuinely believe that doing nothing as a principle is just fundamentally wrong. If you're driving business forward, you always need to be doing something. So I think for me, it's not it's not really what is the nothing. It's what are you doing that is stopping you doing the right thing. So, and I kind of find that there's an awful lot of...
I'm checking out the latest info from gov.uk about how to make your own goals.
I love it. I love technology.
How about that? So for me, it's not about doing nothing. It's about what are you doing that's stopping you doing the right thing. And there's two or three things in that. And just to your point, there is we're doing what we're always doing and we're not proactively doing something. So there's the lack of action. We're just doing more of the same of whatever we do. And then there is the much more proactive part of that, which is right, are we doing the right thing? Should we be doing this? Is what we're doing at the moment right? Is it driving the business forward? And that for me is a prioritization thing. And it's, are you doing the best thing for your company to drive the business forward, to move the dials that you want to move? So the cost of doing nothing is just fundamentally, you have to be doing something. You have to be doing something to occupy your day. And it's more a case of, are you doing the right thing? And then that is a prioritization call. How are you making sure that everyone in the organization is aligned to where you're trying to get the business to be and moving the business forward in the right way? Because the cost of doing nothing, the cost of doing more of the same, if it's not having any impact on your business, is just ridiculous. It becomes almost like a social club. You're all there, you're having a great time, but no one's actually achieving anything. And then your point about leaving decisions late, that's very much a lean concept from the good old Toyota production system. And you always leave decisions as late as you possibly can, so that, as you say, you've got the right information, the most current information, and then you make decisions based on the information you have and the best decision that you can at that time. That doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't be reviewing that decision in 3 months, 1 month, 1 week, to make sure that with any new information, it's the right thing. And you should always feel confident to make changes if what you decided to do last week, last month was the right thing then, but it's the wrong thing today, then you should feel confident to make a balanced judgment of, do we complete what we've got on the books in flight, because it's still adding a bit of value, but it's still not as much as you wanted, or do you change and actually go into this is the thing that adds the most value for the organization and drive forward? So I think that's a process thing. But for me, it's prioritization. The whole cost of doing nothing is dependent entirely on the cost of your team, your development team, predominantly your development team, product managers, engineers, testing, your business stakeholders that are involved in those projects and programs and development of that product or products. Is where the cost comes from. But it's a prioritization decision that you need to be deciding on. Do we not prioritize and do more of the same? Do we prioritize and do something that moves the dial?
So I guess the key thing I've took away from that then is first you need to be aware. You need to be aware of your current situation and obviously the situation of others. To not go into this in a subconscious way, but be more alert and be more aware of what's going on, and be as you say, conscious of the decision making that you are taking. And if you are leading it, if you are taking your time and delaying a decision for whatever reason, then you're doing it in a conscious way and not in a I'm just putting off that decision because I don't really want to make it type of scenario.
I like that word, conscious decision making. For me, it's conscious decision making. The decision to do more of what you're doing today is actually not a bad one, as long as it's conscious. You've thought about it, you've weighed it up, you've kind of done in your head that I could do something different. But if you're 2 weeks away from delivering a new product that will add 4% to your bottom line, or you could change to do something that is going to take you 6 months but will add 12% to your bottom line, it's actually not a bad decision to say, we'll just finish off what we've got, we'll get the 4% in the bag in the next 2-3 weeks, and then we'll move on to the next thing. So that conscious decision making for me is the ultimate goal.
And do you think that there's certain decisions that I guess lend themselves to be more, I guess, I wouldn't say quick, but more, I guess, spontaneous versus sort of longer term impacts maybe, and those types of decisions may become a little bit more discussed, more thought through. I'm thinking, Jeff Bezos came out, I think, a few years back and mentioned around these two types of decisions that he makes within Amazon, or Amazon employees make, and he categorizes them as two types of decisions. There's type 1 and type 2. So one is a little bit more, I guess, consequential. It's more sort of it's reversible. It's a reversible action, and the way he I think positions it is that if you went through the door and it turned out to be the wrong decision, you can always turn back and go back through the door. Where there's certain decisions the business may make that once you've gone through that door, that's it. There's no turning back. So they are irreversible decisions. And he goes on to, I guess, make the point that if you're not making decisions very often, there's a trap that you may fall into, that you treat all of them as sort of this type 2 decision making. So everything becomes a life and death situation, even if it is a reversible one, because you're not used to making those decisions. You tend to treat them all the same, and you overthink things, and you may do far too much research, and again, you may procrastinate far too long, and again, to the detriment of the business.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, that yes, absolutely, and it's a great way of thinking about it. I like quite a lot of the thinking that Jeff Bezos does in his annual letters to his shareholders and things. But for me, I think, yes, if you're not used to making decisions, that's definitely a problem. But I think that's also a culture within your organization. If you're working in an organization whereby there's a test and learn culture, there is a iterate process, then the vast majority of decisions that you'll be making will be reversible. We'll give this a go. We'll put it through an A/B test. If it works, great. If it doesn't, we've learned something new and we don't do that again. So I think there's a huge part of the organisation, the structure of the organisation, the type of organisation, the culture within the organisation, which are huge to those things. But equally, I think there's also a level of decision making. So most organisations have three different layers of thinking. You have the strategy, and your strategy is generally where are we trying to get to in 3-5 years time, and that's a much further on further fit thinking thing. You then have operational decisions of, right, what is it we're doing, what capabilities are we setting up, how do we get there, what do we need to do for the next 3 months to achieve the goals for the next year, 2 years. And then you have the tactical decision making. And I think in any of those three levels, the playing field that you're on differs, and the impact of making the wrong decision is different. But I think you've heard, and most people have heard of the concept now in minimum viable product. I'm hoping to write a blog post actually, because I think it's so valuable. But I think we're now in a world whereby it's minimum viable anything. It is every decision you make, what is the bare minimum that you can do to validate that decision? Will it be your product? Will it be a feature? Will it be your company strategy? Will it be entering a new market? It is now minimum viable anything. And the mindset should go with that. What's the least I can do to validate my decision-making process, so that if I've made the wrong one, I reverse out of it. If I've made the right one, I keep going forward. And it's minimum viable anything. At least for me, that's the mindset in my head.
And I totally agree with that. I think one of the things that I do quite a lot is the tactics and the strategies that you employ in the tech world. So you talk about A/B testing and measuring and learning and iterating, and potentially even down to an algorithm level, or matching patterns. You see patterns everywhere within software development, but they can apply in the real world as well. As you were saying, you don't have to, you can take some of those principles and apply them in the real world in business, whether it's hiring someone in a specific role that you've never had before.
Yeah.
And you just want to trial that out, or it's going into a different vertical and tackling a different industry, and just putting your toe in the water and trialing that out. Generally, those same principles do apply, and I think for me that's becoming more and more ingrained within businesses that I work with. They tend to get that. One of the things that I do often see is the misuse of the word or acronym MVP. And
it's hugely misused. People still do not understand it. I've been working with a friend of mine who's got involved in a business, and they've decided on what their MVP is. And when you look at the feature list that's in it, it's not MVP. It's drop one of the software, and people are assuming that MVP is the first release, and MVP is not the first release. And where most businesses, for me anyway, are getting the whole concept wrong, is they are viewing the startup mentality, which is where a lot of this thinking is, and it's driving a lot of management thinking. And I'll come back to that in a second. But what they're using MVP for is, this is the first release. So we've got a first release and we need the first release to get out there to do stuff. But in the startup world, your MVP is not your first release. Your MVP is purely your test of your hypothesis. Is the hypothesis right? Is my MVP enough to prove the hypothesis, to disprove the hypothesis, and therefore I have a business or I don't have a business? And that allows you to pivot. But your MVP is significantly before your first release. And you want your MVP to be in front of customers. You want it to be giving you feedback, but it's not your first release. It's your first release to prove a hypothesis. It's not your first release of the branding's perfect, the features list is enough to get people to pay for it. I think it was Reid Hoffman that said, if your MVP is not embarrassing, you've done too much. And way too many people are actually making MVPs that are stunningly attractive. They function well. They do everything, but they're building this. They're investing in it significantly before they actually prove that it's the thing that the customers want. And that for me is a fundamental flaw, because you're talking about investing 100 grand rather than investing 5. And it's the wrong mindset that goes with the MVP product. And equally, the minimum viable anything is that take it back. I have a decision to make. My hypothesis is if I make this decision, this will be the outcome. What do you need to do to prove that your outcome is the right thing that will happen based on that decision? And it becomes a very, very powerful tool. And sorry to kind of keep going, but the other thing that you mentioned was the tech thinking. I see an awful lot of the lean startup, and not necessarily the stuff from Eric Ries, but Steve Blank and people like that, who had the thinking well before Eric Ries wrote the book, the Toyota production system, which was, well, that must be about 60 years old, 40, 60 years old, something like that. The thinking has been there for a long while. Eric Ries encapsulated it in a successful book that made it popular to the masses, if you like. But you're now seeing this thinking coming from the tech world, becoming popular, becoming successful. Startups are being hugely successful using this thinking. And then suddenly what you have is the same thinking being now applied to every other function within your business. So you've got agile strategy, lean strategy, iterative strategies, iterative marketing, agile marketing. I've done a workshop for a client on agile marketing. And it's kind of like, guys, this is not rocket science. This is purely a way of actually changing your mindset so that rather than actually trying to predetermine everything you're going to do, an entire plan end to end, you start thinking about the outcomes that you want to achieve as opposed to the tasks and the output that you're going to create. And for me, and I've yet to find a suitable description, but the management thinking that is coming out of startups and coming out of that whole ecosystem, predominantly starting in Silicon Valley, they've managed to take all of these different management principles, different management thinking, and make it into something that is cohesive and workable. And now it's being spread across the rest of the world as if it's a whole new concept, and it's actually kind of not, but it works, and therefore people are starting to kind of pick up on it. But I don't know what you call that. It's not a startup mentality. It's not a startup process. But that's where it's kind of been popularized. So it's almost business 2.0 or leadership 2.0 or management thinking 2.0 or probably 5.0 at this point.
I guess this is one of my bugbears, is that the amount of people that ban the term, and going back to the MVP, banding that term around and not having even spent time to read Eric Ries's book or Steve Blank's or Bob's as well, who's his partner in crime. None of the people that talk about this on a daily basis, or a lot of them, will not have read or spent the time to read and understand exactly what they're talking about. Yeah. And I think that's where, I guess, the word viable becomes the grey area, and understanding what viable means to one person versus to another. And I think, again, going back to the Reid Hoffman quote about him being embarrassed, I think there's also there's this level of, okay, well, if you do put crap out there, then you're just measuring how crap it is. Yeah. So rather than having a half-assed product, you have half a product, which is a term that Basecamp use quite a lot. So you're having a very small slice of functionality, but it's potentially done well. So you're not spending hundreds of thousands in terms of investment, but you are proving exactly what you need to prove. But at least people will use it because it maybe is usable, it's accessible, it's half good looking. So for me, I think it's also this misconception that it has to be rubbish, it has to be rough and ready, and it has to be something that gets put out there. Because when you start measuring that and assuming that, I mean, I ask the question a lot when someone does something, why are you doing it a certain way?
Yeah.
And they go, well, it's all right, we'll test it. And I'll go, well, we know what you're doing is wrong. We know because of convention, of best practice, of user research. We know what you're doing right now for this feature is wrong.
Yeah.
And you're now using the excuse is we're going to test it. So all you're doing is proving that you've done it wrong.
Yeah.
Ultimately. And if you then iterate on that, you are comparing something that is wrong with something that is probably slightly less wrong. Whereas you should at least start with your best efforts, I think, your best intentions, and understanding, that you've got to that date. You're making the best possible chance of it to succeed, or else if it doesn't succeed, then all you've learned is that your execution of that feature has failed, not necessarily the concept or the theory has failed.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you still have to go in, from my perspective, with your best efforts. You really need to do that, because you're not giving it a fair chance. Ultimately, I think people's expectations are higher as well today, so you need to have at least some level of effort involved to prove whether it's the right thing to move forward with.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think there is I'm going to do it this way because I think this is the best way, even though best practice and everything else tells you that actually it's not. And I think people get too hung up on I think. And at the end of the day, it's a very liberating concept when you actually start to understand that you know nothing. And the starting place then is, okay, so what has everyone else done when they've had a similar issue or a similar problem or a similar thing they're trying to resolve? Where did they go to? And then you can iterate on that in your thinking. You don't need to have an MVP, but they did it this way and they were hugely successful. They did it that way and they were hugely unsuccessful. I'm trying to achieve something differently. So how do I make what I'm trying to achieve the most successful thing it can do? Therefore, my hypothesis is if I do it slightly different from that guy who was hugely successful, I will be equally as successful for my thing that's slightly different. And I'll test that. Testing doesn't take away from good judgment and good decision making. It should be supporting and validating good decision and judgment. But yeah, too many people are lazy. Too many people are going through the process. And the process itself is great and it works really well, but it doesn't take away from if you've got a bad decision, then everything falls apart anyway.
Okay. Should we talk about the cost then of some of these decisions, or I guess not making some of these decisions? Obviously, the thing that pops to my mind is once you've made a decision, you've got this fork in the road. You can never sort of go back and undo it to some degree because you've already gone on that journey. It's very difficult to I guess predict what might have happened if you'd have done it differently.
You never have a control group.
Correct. So, but I think again going back to patterns and what you can see in the industry, and I think the thing that comes to my mind is the Blockbuster story, and them not being proactive or making certain decisions, and the cost that to them is obviously the biggest cost of all, which is going out of business. And I think we see that quite a lot in our industry, that people have rested on their laurels and have paid the ultimate price. But then we see things, I guess, Facebook have just released their TikTok competitor, and I guess Facebook do this quite a lot. If you can't buy the company, you replicate. Biggest form of flattery, I guess. But I wonder what decision making they made around how they will release that. They've chose to release it through Instagram as opposed to their main Facebook platform. They could have created a new product.
But I think the two examples you've given are very different. Facebook had nothing to lose by creating a new product. And let's be honest, Facebook are so wealthy the cost of them doing it was nothing to their P&L. A blip. So the cost to them in real terms was nothing. The potential upside is huge. Whereas I think it's much more interesting to look at the Blockbuster example, because I see this quite a lot in boardrooms up and down the country, up in the world, to be honest. It's your entire industry is being disrupted, and I hate the word disruption, which is probably a topic for another day, but your entire industry is being disrupted. Who actually has the courage to go to the board of that company and say, look guys, last year we were worth $1 billion. Our whole industry is being disrupted. And what I'm telling you is our revenue is going to be 700,000, 400,000, zero in a matter of 3-4 years, unless we change things. That in itself is fine. But it's when you say, and by the way, it's going to take us 2 years to change. So what you're saying is our 1 billion in revenue is 700,000, 400,000. And then if we are lucky, we will be a competitor in this new industry, this new way of delivering stuff. So you're actually telling all of your shareholders, you've lost 600,000, whatever the number is, in value, in revenue in the company, just because you need to compete. And I think it's the fear of missing out, it's the fear of loss. And I think the fear of loss can negatively impact a significant number of decisions. Rather than looking at, wow, we're going to be worth nothing in 3 years' time, or we can be worth 400,000 in 2 years' time. Let's go with the 400,000. Let's look at what we maintain, as opposed to we're losing 600,000. Wow, we can't have that. You need to come up with a new strategy that means that we don't lose anything. And I think that fear of loss drives an awful lot of decision making. Whereas in the example of the Facebook, they had nothing to lose. TikTok is taking over from a number of probably more Snap type features. But they build it themselves, they iterate, and in their grand P&L, it's probably not even 1% or 1% of 1% of what they've actually invested in it.
Yeah, but you say it's different, but ultimately at some point in time, Blockbuster had the option to buy Netflix for a measly sum of, I guess, $1 billion or something. And they chose, rightly or wrongly, not to do that. They chose not to create their own streaming service, whereas Facebook saw a competitor, let's face it, nowhere near the same size, but Netflix wasn't the same size as Blockbuster when it first launched. So Facebook have identified a threat and have been proactive and made the decision. Whether it's a successful decision may even be irrelevant. It's more around a defensive strategy, and they've took the decision to spend a few billion creating Reels and bringing it on their platform, whereas Blockbuster didn't. So I guess, yes, I can see what you're saying, that it is different, but ultimately at some point in time, the strategy around making that decision, I think, is the same. That one company decided to do it and the other company didn't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think ultimately there's a history, there's a track record through all of business of bad decisions. But there's a flip side, a history and track record of good decisions, and you see the value of those decisions. I think the difference possibly is with a company like Facebook is they can afford to make billions of dollars worth of bad decisions and really not notice that it was a bad decision at all. So going back to your Jeff Bezos thing of decisions that will have a permanent impact that you can't go back on, and decisions that you can go back on. For Facebook, I'm just going to make numbers up, but Facebook can make 10 or 20 billion pounds worth of $1 billion worth of bad decisions and still reverse out of it. And actually, they had a bad quarter that quarter, but who cares? They'll have a good year anyway. So there is scale that goes with that, and that allows you to be a bit braver with the decisions that you're making. I remember with News Corp in the time of when publishers were all going behind paywalls. And in the UK, News Corp put the Times newspaper behind a paywall. And it was a really strange decision that they had made, because ultimately the Times readership went from something like, I can't remember the actual numbers, it was something like 12 million readers to the web, to the day that they went behind the paywall with subscribers. They were sending out emails. So there was an email marketing campaign that gave you the headlines and little bits of paragraphs and stuff. So they went from a 12 million readership, I think it was, to the first day they had 2,500 readers on the email. And it's like, that is a ballsy decision to make. But interestingly, in the UK, they went behind a paywall completely. So there was no, I forget what they called it. There was no read 2 articles a month, read the first half of an article. It was a solid paywall as opposed to being allowed to penetrate it to get you in and read it. Whereas in Australia, News Corp, with their titles out there, they had this paywall that allowed you to penetrate. So you could go in and you could read 3 articles, or you could read the first half of an article and then you'd get the second half by subscribing and things like that. And News Corp was so big, essentially from a business point of view and a market, a country by country market point of view, they were A/B testing the UK versus Australia. How would readers react, and which was the best model to use for your business, pitting the UK against Australia? And that's a ballsy move, and that's a very expensive move, and it could easily have killed the UK market or easily have killed the Australian market. But when you're that big, actually you can reverse out of it if you need to. So you've lost the UK market, you increase your marketing budget in the UK to 15, 20 million, as opposed to the 1 or 2 million that you've got normally. So the cost of making a wrong decision is 20 million in a marketing campaign. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But as you say, they made a proactive decision to try that. They saw the decline in paper sales, so they saw that they had to do something, and they could either just sit there and let the business go down the pan, or they can trial out these new business models. And
exactly, and going back to the cost of the cost of doing nothing. The cost of doing something might be expensive, but the biggest cost any business ever has is the cost of doing nothing. Doing nothing is abdicating your responsibility as a business, as a business leader, to just say, oh, I've got no idea what the next right thing is, we'll just wait and see, because that never works out well. You've got to try things, you've got to kind of be light of foot, you've got to be agile, you've got to be out there trying stuff, you've got to be out there understanding your customers and their needs. And if that means that your business has to evolve, that's the job of businesses, to evolve to meet the customer need. The cost of doing nothing is tantamount to business suicide at that level.
So I just want to pick up on what you mentioned around it being a ballsy decision in terms of the newspapers. But I guess generally in business, if let's say you're a new CEO coming and you just joined a business, or even if you're an existing CEO of a business and you're seeing it declining, I guess some people might think it's easier to stay below the parapet and to just carry on and not try and shake the boat or challenge the status quo, especially if there's stakeholders and a board of directors and so forth that you need to sell this into. I guess from your perspective, do you as a CEO yourself going into businesses, do you see how do you see that panning out in terms of the strategy around having to have those difficult decisions and discussions around, if we don't do something, it's going to be a lot worse than if we do nothing? And what are the strategies have you used in the past to help, I guess, sell that? Because I guess it is a sell to some extent, and not having that, well, if we do nothing, I can't tell you what's going to happen, but we can do, I guess, prediction. And we talked about the patterns. Facebook has obviously saw the patterns in history around Blockbuster and the likes. So they've probably harnessed that and gone, we need to do something if we don't end up like this. Talk to me about some of your experiences around that.
It's funny because I actually find those conversations quite simplistic. There's a concept, and I've had that with a couple of boards, and to be honest, a couple of investors more than the boards themselves. There's a concept that what you want to do is you want to stabilize your business. If your business is in trouble, stabilize it, get to an even keel, and then you can decide where you're going next or how you move forward. And for me, there is no stable business. A business is either growing or it's declining. Stability is a single point in time that just does not exist. It's fleeting. If you're not doing something to grow your business, by definition, your competitors are and your business is in decline. So it becomes a very simplistic thing of we can reduce the decline, still declining, or we can focus on growth and we can grow the business. Neither the two of those options involve doing nothing. The worst you can do is do nothing because your business is not stable. Doing nothing is a declining business. And at that point, when you actually kind of start to look at those figures, get the data points, get the metrics that actually show that the business is losing market share, it's losing revenue, the share of baskets reducing, whatever metrics it is that you're using, it becomes very obvious to everyone that actually the business is in decline and therefore you need to do something. The question then becomes one less of do something or no, don't do something. It's what do you do? And for me, that pretty much always comes down to the size of the ambition and the willingness to fund that ambition. Just because you're in a declining market doesn't mean to say you can't go after growth. You can't be aggressively going after growth. You can't go for a 10x mindset, 10x revenue increase. But you do need to fund that. That comes at a capital cost. It comes at an operational cost. It comes at a working capital cost. And you need to have the investors, backers to drive that. And then if you don't have that funding available to you or the working capital available to you, then you need to start putting in place strategies that will help you grow the business, come away from decline, and actually be much more tactical about what you're doing. And that very often can mean you sacrifice one part of your business to fund another part of your business. That, for me, is a perfectly valid strategy. The human cost of that very often is unpalatable or unpleasant, rather. But the business is there to grow as a business, and you need to make those decisions on a day-to-day basis. So it very much becomes down to less trying to sell the fact that you need to do something and more trying to sell the fact that what you want to do is the right thing to do for the business. And I've said several times before, for me, you don't create a strategy. What companies need to do is they need to dismiss all the strategies that won't have the impact that they want to have. Because any business can do 10 different things. But generally, there's only one or two that will actually have the impact that they want to have, that their ambition drives. In which case, you've got a choice between A or B. Which one do you think is going to have the best impact? Or if they're both having similar impacts, which one will have the impact with the least risk? And those become very almost binary decisions once you've got the data behind them.
So I guess that's going back to what you were talking about earlier around having those tactical, operational, and sort of higher level strategy decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess all of those feed into sort of the vision, whether it's the product vision or the company vision. And I guess at some point, it may be that vision is incorrect. And, you know, at one stage it was great, but then I'm going to use the word pivot, unlikely. And the business needs to have a change of direction to survive. And I guess, you know, you're then sort of going out of the bounds of the normal thinking of the business, I guess, so that everyone within that organization is all heading towards this one goal. And then you're basically saying, well, you know, we're in a situation where we need to sort of look at a different playing field, or a different sport even. I guess that's it. That's less likely to happen in day-to-day business, but it does happen, and people have done that. I think Sony is again a big big story around that of going from one industry to another and making it work. So what were your experiences around not just a slight tilt in direction, but literally a 180-degree turn and going a totally different direction?
One, I wouldn't call that a pivot. And two, I think doing that is incredibly difficult because essentially what you're saying is you're in the wrong business. What I have experienced, and to be honest, the only way to do that is to continue with the wrong business while alongside that you start building up the right business until you can maintain the revenue of the new business before you lose the revenue of the old business. I have kind of worked with a few companies whereby what you try and do is tactically you shore up a poor offering or a poor business model while you recreate that alongside that. And essentially what you do is you bleed the existing business dry and use that funding to create a new business model, a new customer offering, a new service out there. But it's very challenging, and there is a very fine balance to be had of how much resources do you put into the old business model to get short-term income, and how much do you abandon that to focus on the future and get everyone behind those. And it's quite a challenge to achieve that. I
mean, just to answer that point, actually, just to go into that, just going back to patterns around the tech world and the real world, that strategy that migration strategy, I guess, is something we use in tech a lot around moving from, let's say, a legacy application or a platform or a product into a newer technology. So you've got this existing product. So you can see that in your eyes as the existing business, and then the new greener grass over here that you need to move to remove all the technical debt. And there's a pattern we call the Strangler fig pattern, believe it or not. And
Strangler fig. I've not heard that.
Yeah.
I'm aware of the concept. I've never heard that pat. Strangler fig.
Yes. So it's essentially a vine that grows in Australia, and it's named after that. So essentially what this vine does is it basically wraps around a tree, and it's essentially what ultimately starves a tree, but you're basically starving the legacy application to move over to the next, and you're basically building around it. You're building the new one around it. But it's quite interesting. Again, we can see these patterns across the two different.
For me, and it'd be interesting to kind of get, because most of what we've spoken about today is the business logic, the business layer. But for me, all of these things are just pure logic. It's not business logic, and most of it is applicable and has been stolen from tech and how you deliver tech. So yeah, I mean, from a tech point of view, I'm assuming that all of these concepts are the same. All of the cost of do nothing is there. It's probably a bit easier to understand because if you've got a legacy platform, the cost of doing nothing is increased support, increase lack of customer satisfaction, increase of downtime, increase of wasting effort in doing a 3-month project to show something up that you're hoping to kind of kill in 9 months. What's your kind of experience around over there?
So generally, what I see is that if there is a legacy application, generally in a sort of monolithic architecture, it cripples the business's throughput and innovation. So you have this balance of keeping the existing product afloat. So your maintenance costs go through the roof. Your new features that you're trying to produce take far longer than they would normally because you've got this one big monolithic application that potentially not a lot of people have worked on because of the churn of staff over the years. So we're talking at something that could be 10 years old. The knowledge of the platform may not be there, so people are less likely to make what we call sort of breaking changes. And then instead, rather than fix sort of and do it properly, they will bolt it onto the side, and then by doing that, create more technical debt, more workarounds, and hence add more fuel to the fire. So you get into this vicious circle of essentially just suffocating your business. So the features start to drop off. So customers don't get any new features. Bug fixes take longer and longer to fix. People become demoralized, especially developers, because they don't want to be working on some of these things. So it's a slippery slope that you see throughout the whole of the business and the customer base. And if you don't move to a more agile platform, so more distributed, scalable architecture, for example, and more automated ways of deployments and safer ways to deployment and automated testing and things like that, then you get to a point where the business suffers, and you can see that in a lot of businesses. So as you say, you would have a migration strategy. You can't just go and a lot of businesses can't just go and build like Facebook have a TikTok overnight. Whereas a lot of businesses will use the existing capital of their customer base at the moment on their existing platform, and start siphoning off some of that capital into investment into the new platform, and have a migration to, over time, maybe it's a year or 2 years, and depending on the size of the system, to gradually move away. And there's certain patterns that we can use. The Strangler fig pattern is one. Parallel run or parallel chain is another one, where you have two systems in hand in hand. Ultimately, you can redirect certain users to certain parts of the system, so you can replace parts of the legacy system, and over time it creates a new system.
That was very much what we did at the Guardian. But when I joined the Guardian, the entire platform was just one big monolith, and we actually created a team. We had 15 teams in total, I think, or we created over time 15. We went from 70 to 170 people there at the time. So I think we created 15 teams, maybe not as much as that, 12, 11. And what we had was one team, and their whole focus, at least initially, was to essentially to retrofit into this monolith a service-orientated architecture. And then what you can actually do is, within the system, some users for some parts of their journey went to the old system, and some went to a new system, and it became very obvious. And I've not been involved in the Guardian for probably 10 years now. It became very obvious that I think there was about 40 or 60% of the system, there was no point changing it. There was no point upgrading it. It's an old monolith. It was a pain in the bum. But the reality is, it never changed day to day. There was no need to change it on a regular basis. So I think I'm going to say maybe we changed 40% of it and left 60% of it. But the 40% of it that we changed, we went from being in a 2-week release cycle to being able to release new software, new features on a 3.5-minute cycle. So every 3.5 minutes, we could release a new piece of software. No downtime to the customer, anything like that. But that was the parallel running that you talk about. So it was a combination of the old and the new, but there's no point replacing the old because you never touched it. It worked. And if it broke, you just took the tax almost of, right, that's an old piece of the system. No one knows how it works, but we'll fix it. We'll make it work. But you weren't changing it every week, every month. There was no desire to upgrade it, to put new features into it. And I kind of did something very similar I did an exercise very similar with Marks and Spencer's, whereby we kind of established that the hosting cost that they had was just ridiculous. Because what they actually had was they had everything in a hosting environment that was 100% uptime, millisecond access, and it was just ridiculous. It's like, you need that for the transactional part of your website, but the vast majority of the website was not transactional. People reading an article about the latest fashion, about the style of some influencer, you didn't need that level of hosting environment, that level of response. And therefore, by splitting off the applications within the environment into those that you needed millisecond response, 100% uptime, guaranteed, because if it went down, it was costing you tens of thousands of millions of pounds, as opposed to pieces of content and parts of your system that were just there. If that goes down for 10 minutes, who cares? It's not impacting on the customer journey significantly. It's not impacting on your ability to take money and generate revenue. So why have all of your hosting environment viewed as this millisecond responsive and uber important to your business that it needed to be 100% up all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to the type 1 and type 2 decisions that we talked about earlier. It's it's quite easy for people to blanket their thinking, to think that everything has to be the best or everything has to be the same. So when you take one approach, you talk about the dish, going from a monolith to an SOA. You've been sort of aware enough to understand that you don't need to do the whole lot. Having a partial monolith is fine. And let's face it, monoliths aren't bad. Generally they're just coupled and they tend to be confused with legacy code, and they come hand in hand. But generally, a monolith as an architecture is a great architecture for starting off. It's just doesn't scale very well.
To be honest, even legacy sometimes is acceptable. I worked with Scottish Amicable, which got bought out by Prudential, so it's part of Prudential Insurance. And I remember years ago, we were taking them through Y2K back in the day, 20 years ago. And they were upgrading all of their systems. And I remember having this long, protracted, over weeks argument, because there was a Windows 3.1 server in the organization that they wanted to upgrade. And it's like, at this point, you just upgrade it. I mean, it's so meaningless in the cost of it. But they wanted to upgrade it because it was not Y2K compliant. It was Windows 3.1. But the reality was it was being used as a print server. So systems would just go and pull it. If there was a file there, it would print it. And if there wasn't a file there, it would ignore it. And it would just pull every minute or every 2 minutes, and anything that was in there would get printed and then deleted, printed and then deleted. And it's like, actually, that being non-Y2K compliant, who cares? It's still going to be there. The file is still going to be there. And the fact that it thinks it's 1900 rather than 2000, 1 minute or 2 minutes in 1900 doesn't matter for polling. And that became a whole protracted thing. The other thing with legacy systems is Marks and Spencer's, probably to this day, it makes about 30 million a year selling Christmas turkeys, of all things. The system that controls the customer's details, the selling, and the supply of those Christmas turkeys has not been touched in years, if not decades, because no one has the courage to. It's an old mainframe system. They don't have access to the underlying code of it. And everyone's scared that if they touch it, it breaks, and that's £30 million worth of revenue that's at risk. And it's like, actually, it's working. Just, it would scare the bejesus out of me, to be honest. But
yeah, that's what I mean. It's working now, but I bet if it starts to pack up come November, and
exactly.
Not got the skill set in house, because, I mean, I saw something the other day that the amount of government systems, I think, running in the US that is running COBAL still to this day. And I mean, there's two sides from my perspective. Is A, getting the resource and the skill set in to keep these things running. As these technologies die off, it becomes an ever increasing challenge to find the right people with the right skills. But more importantly than that, or as importantly as that, is security. A lot of these systems aren't being patched anymore. So, if you was to keep a Windows XP system running, it could be a gateway into your network.
It depends if it's got access to the internet and external access and things, which most COBAL systems, old mainframe systems, don't anymore, thankfully, or don't at all.
But you look at the NHS. The NHS didn't upgrade their XP and become
the malware. That's, for me, that's unforgivable, though. That's a very clear, obvious risk that they just ignored. So the cost of doing nothing was actually being held ransom. Going back to finding old COBAL developers. Sorry?
Yeah. I would say the NHS and the UK police force and people like the US Navy SEALs pay Microsoft tens of millions of pounds a year for that out of band support for those legacy systems. And I think Microsoft earn quite a substantial amount of money off that as compared to sort of like new sales of Windows. So again, there's a cost of doing nothing, is that you're still paying for it regardless.
I mean, you're paying for it. It's just whether you're paying to move your business forward or you're paying to maintain the status quo. There's a significant cost of doing nothing, Whereas paying to move your business forward actually hopefully comes with revenue as well as cost. But yeah, the COBAL question though, when I first started 20 years ago, when I first really got into technology, I worked with a consultancy that no longer exists in Scotland. And what we did was we actually brought people out of retirement for COBAL skills. The consultancy was it was a New Zealand guy, I think, who was ex-military and set the consultancy up purely as an opportunistic thing. He wasn't a tech guy at all. But you recognise that COBAL skills at that point were hugely in demand, and everyone wanted to go into the sexy VB3 at the time, I think it was. Awesome. So he brought people out of retirement. He also instigated and paid for a number of training courses whereby newly retired people could go away and learn COBAL. What was it, Microfocus? They had a version of COBAL that you could run on a PC. So we would literally just train people who had been into early retirement or retired, and we'd train them up in Microfocus COBAL on a PC, and then we'd let them loose onto clients' mainframes to write COBAL. And it was a great business model. It's not sexy, but there's a big demand for it. And we did that. I remember there was a guy, and I won't say his name, but there was a guy I worked with 20 years ago who was, I think he had retired. He was probably in his 60s then. But he'd got into technology way back in the day when it was punch cards. And that was one of the things that I loved. And it's one of the things I hate about technology today. The problem with technology today is you can write any bad code. You can pretty much put it over a broadband connection. PCs and laptops are more than powerful enough to operate bad code. You can send it down the line and it works because the hardware and the infrastructure that it's running on will just compensate, and it's fine. Unless you're doing something that's real time or in C or something like that, the hardware will compensate for the vast majority of user applications that are badly written. And he was telling me about old punch cards, and you had to write your entire program in 4K. Not 4 meg, not 4 gig. Your entire program was 4K, and you had to write it. So for me, there was always an elegance and an efficiency that old school mindset brought that today we don't care about anymore. It's like, yeah, it gets the job done. Let's just thrash it out there. And I think most code and most engineers, there's a passion and a desire to do it the way that they like doing it. But I'm not sure that I always see that efficiency and that elegance in coding that was there in the olden days. God, I kind of feel like I'm ancient now.
No, I totally agree. And I think, I guess you don't optimize unless there's a need to, because of this squeeze, I guess, around productivity. And that's the invention and proliferation of frameworks like React and Angular, for example, on the front end. Yeah. They're like 150 kilobytes ish download. And yes, it's a big of a hit, but it gets cached on one time. But the productivity of the team increases. So the cost of wages, you get more for your buck, and essentially the user is taking the hit on your behalf. So there's this balance of productivity gains versus optimizations versus performance versus, and you see that a lot. And again, these are the micro tactical decisions, I guess, that we were talking about around, where do you spend your effort and where do you spend your time? What is most important? Because there's always a trade-off. You can have, let's say, a really pretty website with lots of nice high-res images, but that's going to come down the wire a lot slower than more optimized images or no images at all. But you don't want a website with just text on it, because it's obviously not going to be appealing. It's not, the marketing department's not going to be very happy. So I guess it is this trade-off around priorities and understanding, up the chain, what is the vision, what is most important to the business and to that software.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny, the whole kind of efficiency thing. I'm trying desperately to think of the very famous author who said it, but there was an author who kind of said, I didn't have time to send you a short note, so I sent you a long one instead. And it's the same with code. It's exactly the same thing. Actually writing short, efficient, elegant code, letters, anything, it takes time. You have a time commitment in that. Writing just brain dumping is much easier, and it's the same with code. You just pick up libraries, you pick up someone else's code, you pick up a piece of code you wrote before. It's not quite the same, but it does. Yeah, I can spend 20 minutes changing this bit, 3 days doing this, and it saves me 4 weeks work or whatever it is. But yeah, it does miss that elegance, and the perfectionist in me quite likes that elegance. Not that I've ever written elegant code myself. I just hacked code.
Yeah, I think we are also seeing a trend where, again, for the last 30 odd years, whatever, 50 years, we've always been taught in programming to don't repeat yourself, which is the dry way of working. So you write something once and reuse it as many times as you can. That sounds really efficient, and it is. But the trends are, funnily enough, going from dry to wet. Which is write everything twice. And the reason why the trends are going that way is around autonomy and loose coupling. So if you've got a service that shares, if you've got two services that shares something from a single service because you're reusing it, then essentially these two services are there coupled together. So you change that, you've broken two services. As opposed to just the one. So the idea is that you would have that piece of centralized logic in both services as a duplicate. So you're writing things twice, but each team, so you've got a team that runs this service and a team that runs this service, can operate independently and autonomously, more importantly, without fear of breaking each other's service. And if that service then goes down, it's also redundant. So we're seeing a trend moving away from, I guess, that what we would call in the past efficient coding to more redundant coding. And again, the thought of trying to not break someone else's code or someone else's service actually is time consuming in its own right. If you know that you're writing just for you, so it's, I guess it's a little bit like working in a team versus working on your own. If you're just building an application on your own, you don't need to worry about anyone else. You're quite safe to do it the way you want. And that's a little bit like these cross-functional autonomous teams that can essentially work in their own silos without fear of breaking someone else. Your efficiencies repaid through that level of work as opposed to the actual coding itself. So it's just an interesting
that's an interesting thing. I'm not sure I agree with that all the time, but I think there are cases when you do want to duplicate code. I think there has to be an argument that says if you've got a shared piece of code, a shared service, if you like, then it has to be predefined what you put into that, what the parameters are that go in, and what the parameters are that you get back out. And if one team is going to change that, then they need to start sharing with all the other teams what they're changing. And it doesn't mean to say that you actually need to duplicate that whole service. You can just duplicate the inputs into it and the outputs, and then put another one alongside it or something like that. So I'm not sure that I agree with that as a blanket decision to do all the time, but there is the point of the cost of opportunity. But there's the cost of opportunity in there as well. If I need to coordinate with 15 other teams the changing of this one shared service, and that's going to take 6 months because team 15 are on a release cycle and they're not going to be able to update their piece of code that uses that shared service for 6 months because of their roadmap, actually duplicate it. Get it out there, because the cost of waiting 6 months for everyone to be aligned is so great that actually the cost of duplicating it is the lesser of the two evils. It's the lesser cost. So you duplicate it and you move forward. And that for me is a very classic case of the cost of doing nothing, or the cost of waiting for that alignment, that efficiency, whereby actually you're getting an efficiency in the wrong part of your business. Your coding is efficient, the software is efficient, it's operating, everyone's sharing the service, but from a revenue and a business point of view, you may be losing thousands, tens of thousands, millions because you waited 6 months to get that alignment. And that for me is a very clear opportunity cost that you're losing, or the cost of doing nothing is too great to, duplicate the service, make it happen, go with it.
Yeah. And I think some of those decisions are really easy to make without the strategic direction, just on a programming level. Generally not want to recreate a whole service generally, and you would obviously leverage the work that has been done. That's where versioning comes in, having different versions of software and being able to upgrade independently of the other service. So you might be, this service over here might be working towards on V1, but what you don't want to do is stop the service progressing because other consumers of your service is reliant upon it. So you create V2, and then this service will continue to use V1, but any other service can then, in their own time, as part of their own roadmap, upgrade when they're ready. And we can see that at the finer level as well. So, you may not want multiple UI controls, for example. Let's say you've got like a date picker of some sort. You don't want every team to recreate the date picker. So again, having I guess like an open source model, I guess. So you would have like your NPM registry or a GitHub where you would have this calendar control, but team B that originally didn't create it may need it to change a little bit. They can pull it up and do a pull request and make a change to that, and continue the progression path of that piece of component, that software. And again, everyone else can get the benefit of that, but upgrade in their own time because of the versioning. So I think, there's obviously balances to be had there. But the key thing is making the right decision.
Yeah, I saw a client in Switzerland actually do something similar, but they did it with the CSS file essentially. So what they did was they created a library of components and a library of design styles, which were consistent. And then all the developers had to accommodate that. They had essentially 3 vertical businesses, and they wanted a level of consistency across each of them. So they created, I forget what they called it, I think it was a live style sheet. And the style sheet was just in every live environment. And if you wanted to change the style, if you wanted to refresh it, you changed the style guide and it just automatically propagated through everything else. And it was a chunk of work. And I'm not convinced it was truly valuable enough to warrant the work that was done. But as a piece of work, it was brilliant. I mean, it was fantastic. But you just change the style guide, and then the whole visual look of all of the sites were consistent, and you never lost that consistency. It was a chunk of work, but
yeah, I see that a lot, especially if you move to a cross-functional set of teams, that you want it to look like one team has built your software, not 5 different teams working in their own little silos. So having that base style sheet or a style guide at least to adhere to, and maybe even
style guides are common, but this did actually built into the code, which I hadn't seen before. This is probably, God knows what, 7 or 8 years ago. I hadn't seen that before. Actually building it into the code, and it was so
generally that would be like a base style sheet that you can import, and that will give you your base style. So generally things that would style the body and the fonts and stuff like that, some key things that isn't going to be changing across the different teams. Again, there's a risk of going too far with that, but generally there's some top level things like normalizing the style sheets and things like that you tend to do at that level.
Exactly.